Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Zach Stein. I'm the Associate Director of Assessment and Student Development at Meridian University. I'm also on the core faculty. We're back again today, once again, for our conversation series entitled Integral Voices. And the idea is to kind of convene conversations on the evolution of culture and consciousness. Now we have over 2,000 participants worldwide who've signed up for events like this, and during each conversation we encourage people to ask questions. So you can ask a question by clicking Ask a Question in the lower right hand corner of the Google Hangouts interface, and that will allow you to type in a question, and we'll be getting to those towards the end of the program. So today's program is entitled Integral We Spaces, a new context for global dialogue. And I'm honored to have with us Elizabeth Debold and Thomas Steininger. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we'll get going here. Thomas Steininger has got a PhD, and he studied philosophy from the University of Vienna. He specialized in consciousness and social evolution, and he looked at the work of Martin Heidegger and Ken Wilber. He's worked for the Austrian radio and as a freelance journalist, and he's the founder of the German magazine Evolve, where he served as a senior editor, and he's now the publisher. He also hosts a weekly web broadcast, Evolve Radio. He's taught at master's programs in consciousness evolution at the Graduate Institute in collaboration with Don Beck, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, Alan Combs, and a host of other integral folks. And he's pioneered the development of Evolutionary Dialogue, which is a new consciousness-aware collective process for creative engagement. Elizabeth Debold, EDD, and fellow Harvard Graduate School of Education alum. She's a leading authority on gender development and author of best-selling Mother and Daughter Revolution, which she based on the research of Carol Gilligan at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She was a senior editor of Enlightened Next magazine, formerly known as What is Enlightenment, for over 10 years, and she's currently also an editor on Evolve magazine in Germany. She's a sought-after expert and commentator by major media outlets in the U.S., including NPR, Oprah, Good Morning America. She's lectured in the U.S., Canada, and Europe. She serves as the academic director of the Masters of the Arts program in Consciousness Evolution at the Graduate Institute, and she taught at Harvard University and the New School for Social Research. So again, like I said, it's an honor to have you here and to be convening this conversation at Meridian about the future of consciousness and the evolution of culture. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Zach.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have to be able to have this conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've spoken before, Elizabeth, of course, in a broadcasted way. But last time you were the convener and the interviewer, and I was the.
That's right. That's right. That's a long time ago.
Many years ago, you and Jeff Carrera and I met, and it was interesting. At that time, we talked about developmental psychology, and in particular, the higher reaches of human development. And one of the things I mentioned, I think, at the time was that to get to higher levels of human development, kind of post-formal levels or post-conventional levels, often you need a very unique discourse community. You need unique people to speak with and unique forms of communication. And when I think about the work that I know you both are doing on collective dialogue and creating these emergent communal spaces of dialogue, one of the things that excites me the most is the way that helps individuals transform. So I'm wondering if you could talk about, what is this collective we space, and how does the individual benefit, and because we can think about, well, this will help intercultural dialogue and this will help, create peace in social systems. But I think it will also be educational, even at the individual level, in terms of liberating capacity. So that's the way I want to go in as someone who works in human development. Think about what's the educational benefit, classrooms that work like this. How would it liberate human capacity to open up these we spaces?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think it's because the we space that we're speaking about is not about, it's not focused on the individual, and it's not focused on, and yet the individual is intrinsic to the capacity of or the knowledge that's held in the group. But it's in that freedom from, or in that the freedom from a focus on self and a real focus on that which is between us, that then different capacities in the individual are allowed to flourish or emerge that one hasn't recognized in oneself before.
Maybe it's also good to say it helps to understand that there is not only one form of we space, there are different we spaces. And usually when we talk about we space, we don't differentiate between different levels of we space. And you can talk a lot about different levels of we space. One simple way to understand that is first that our individuation process in our human culture and human history comes out of a we space of our traditional and indigenous cultures, where we were in a we space before we developed our individuality. Our tribal identity was a we space identity, and you can say there's something like a primary we space that starts as in indigenous cultures, in traditional mythic cultures, and we developed our individual form of identity and also a form of dialogue and conversation through the process of modernity, where we developed our individual self-sense. And there we developed a certain kind of also we space that is very much related to this individuality. And what Elizabeth was talking about is that maybe there's also a form of we space that includes and transcends both of these we spaces. There's something where we hold something collective beyond our individuality, hold our individuality, but focus on something that we are together already in. And this is something that can be very transformative, because you can become aware of some collective consciousness space that has its own gestalt, that has its own reality, and that usually is kind of blinded by our separate eye sense world. And if we come together in a kind of space of conversation where we are aware that something is alive between us that has a singular whole living gestalt, something different is opening up between us that usually is difficult to see when we very much relate even to our we space from a very self-centered point of view.
So, I mean, you can see in this that it takes at least two things. It takes a capacity for an individuated self to start with, and that's not something to sneeze at, as you know. It takes and it takes a capacity for sensing, or a capacity for depth or awareness that is sort of beyond one's focus on one's thoughts and feelings. So even with those two things are actually quite advanced capacities in human development. But with those two things, and with a focus on that which is between us, there is a different we that can emerge.
That's fascinating. So this has already clarified for me several things in terms of the goals of the kinds of group processes you guys are trying to facilitate. So let me frame a little bit here. Thomas, when I heard you speaking of the levels of the we, and you spoke about how there was the kind of, the archaic or older ancient structures where there was just less of a sense of individuation and more of a sense of being kind of part of this group. And then modernity came in, and now we have this sense of kind of isolated, abstract individualism, kind of almost self-interest, kind of monads, which I think has been amplified by postmodernity, increasingly fragmented and differentiated. And you were looking for a space beyond that. You were looking to reclaim the goodness of both of those. You want the goodness of the autonomy of the individual, who's not, let's say, oppressed by the group and kind of augmented, but you also want a re-enchantment of the we, and a kind of a re-sacralization to make sacred again the space that's between us, and to be held in community again as we were. I think of the individual developmental story, where the infant is at first in a primordial we. Think of Bowlby's work in attachment theory. And then, of course, the dignity of adolescence is to break free from and to assert your individuality. But of course, we can end up in a prolonged adolescent identity crisis where we're never able to find again a we space that's as open and loving as the one we had. Anyway, so I'm seeing these kinds of arcs, these arcs of kind of community and then individuation and then a refinding of community that doesn't negate the individuation. And that's, I think, the trick. Because when we see people who, quote unquote, drank the Kool-Aid, where we see groups that are really, really bound together, many, when the modern and postmodern word fear the kind of merger and the effacement of the self. So I'm just reflecting back to you what I heard, and I'd love to hear your.
Well, what's interesting about what you said about infancy and then adolescence, Zach, is I don't know if you've heard this, but when Dwayne Elgin speaks to crowds, he often asks people around the world, what developmental stage do you think that we're in as human beings? And by and large, I think almost always, almost like 95% of people will say we're adolescent. And I think what we're talking about is perhaps coming to a different kind of adulthood, an adulthood in which we are fully individuated. We're not pushing away any longer, and we're able to really accept the truth of and responsibility for the fact that we're not separate, that we are interrelated and interconnected on every dimension of existence.
Exactly, and in relationship to the we spaces, in a Wilberian integral context, we often talk about rationality and the pre-trans fallacy in forms of pre and trans-rational. I think that something similar or even identical you can say about individuation. There's a pre-individuated and a trans-individuated we space, and they are not the same, although they maybe look the same because they are both not individual separate states, but one transcends, includes the individual, and one hasn't achieved it yet. And many of a very romantic relationship to we spaces just don't look at the difference. And there's a lot of things you can say about, but I think one main thing you have to say about is the difference of freedom. Because there's something in the development of individuation, which is, I think, one that's really about the dignity of modernity, that is the development of free choice and agency. Because as powerful, and I think also we can learn a lot from indigenous we spaces, because they have access to conscious spaces that we maybe in our individuation process lost contact with. There's something very simple. When you're in an indigenous we space, you cannot step out of it. It literally means to step out of an indigenous clan we space. People are not able to survive without that. So you're part of a we space, but you have no choice. Part of the individuation is that we start to have a choice to say also no to the clan we space, and maybe. The different we space that we're looking for is a we space that is freedom-based, that people who are individuated who also can have the choice for separation, make the choice for something that we are together in. But this having a choice for something creates a completely different nature of a we space that is very responsible and also individual-based, but it is a we space.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful to hear, and it's reminding me of work that's done in transformative education, which is the work that Meridian specializes in. Mm-hmm. And you trace it back to Paulo Freire. And you think of the basic educational relationship. Oppressive educational relationships force you into a we space. They give you the language you have to use. They set the conditions under which you learn. Whereas he was trying to create educational spaces, Paulo, that provided them with the ability to create the language to actually name their world, right? A language of freedom, as you're saying. So that's essential, as I was saying, one of the resistances we have to join community as postmodern people. The resistances we have to get actually excited about political movements and to not be cynical. So much of it is because we're afraid we're going to lose the freedom and drink the Kool-Aid. And yet we desperately want to, in part because we're isolated, and there's a part of human nature that needs these open and forms of freedom without coercion. And again, I'm drawn to Habermas's thinking, you know, and even anyway. So I could go on, but Elizabeth, you look like you were about to jump in.
No, what I was going to say is that, and at this time in particular, I think we need the diverse capacities of individuals the things that make us individuals. We need that in service of something larger. And I mean, there are all kinds of stories and documentaries and so forth about extraordinary projects that people have undertaken and brought the best and the brightest together to be able to create something, and no one can get out of their way in order to be actually together. And you know, we definitely want to build on the uniqueness and the expertise and the life experience that individuals bring forward, because it's the integration of that beyond that individual frame, and the kind of creative conflict that comes from different experiences and different forms of knowledge rubbing against each other, that is the way that we're going to create higher level integration. But it has to be done we have to be sharing an intention to hold something beyond in the process of doing this.
And the fascinating thing is that this is something that cannot be done on a theoretical level. You have to do it in the present moments, in the reality of relationship and interaction. So there's something, we are talking to each other over the ocean, and we see each other on the screen, but there's something in our experience that on an experiential, phenomenological level, when you just pay attention, we are together in. There's some process between us that is unfolding that is maybe not very obvious. It needs a kind of a certain attention to be aware of it. But there's something undivided, having a whole gestalt that we are together in, that we can explore. At the same time, what Elizabeth is referring to, this oneness, or this one gestalt that we are together in this conversation that we are having, this process that we are in, is held by our individuation and the separate differences that we bring into this conversation. It has two poles. It has the poles of this oneness that in the end, I think, leads to also a spiritual recognition of non-separation, but it also has to acknowledge that it's held by difference. And there's a place where this oneness and this difference I have to be held together to really appreciate what we are together in as we share community.
Some phenomenology of intersubjectivity there. That's great. So that's good. Let's move down and to get to some practical suggestions about how do you facilitate this in groups, especially groups that are coming from different, let's say, levels of consciousness or levels of development. And I think this is the million-dollar question in a sense, which is we desire these forms of dialogue, and in rare spaces, and I think often elite spaces, we find them, you know. But to democratize these capacities and to find ways to institutionalize or at least have a structure, is that something that's possible? How have you succeeded or not? And because I see many barriers to this, and we can talk more about the barriers, but I'm curious, what are the tools and techniques that catalyze these forms of discourse?
Well, I mean, you spoke about these things happening in elite circles. I think at this point, to a great extent, I mean, I guess there are two. Let me say there are two levels of our work, the work that we're engaged in, and one is to kind of really work to create this living sense of non-separation and difference, and that we would call higher we work. There's the evolutionary dialogue work, which has a much lower bar for entry and engagement, that requires something quite different. It really just requires an attitude of interest in the discussion itself, in engaging in the discussion itself. But in the work that we're trying to do with in terms of global dialogue, what we're looking for is, or what we'd like to do, what we're starting to do, is to create, in some ways, rather rarefied spaces, because we're talking about bringing people together who are across such differences. We're talking about significant cultural, civilizational differences. So in bringing people together in that, across such differences, in that group is not a random group of people from the street. In those circumstances, what we're talking about are people who have a certain level of sensitivity, a certain level of depth, usually their own spiritual practice, because probably each form of spirituality on this planet has some access to or value placed on unity, on some oneness. That may be within the natural world, that may be the absolute dimension, but it's having some experiential recognition and valuing of unity that then allows us to come together and really create something in a field together. Or that's so far what we're experimenting with.
Yeah. In terms of what you're asking, how is this possible in relationship to different means and different levels of development, also on a global scale? First, we are experimenting with that, and we will see where we go with this. But we did have a very interesting experience 2 months ago, where we spent 1 week in preparation of a program that we are developing, One World in Dialogue, where we spent 1 week in the foothills of the Indian Himalayas with a group of Indian friends to talk about this, to talk about dialogue and to talk about global dialogue. And I found it very fascinating what we experienced there, because I felt both the capacity to come together in something where there's a realization, even if we have huge different cultural differences in our cultural background, there is something when you just start talking, that when there is enough awareness and also respect for the shared field, that you can kind of tap into the shared field and let you lead yourself by the emergence of what is happening between us. There's some human experience that happens just by having the capacity to kind of tap into this collective field of dialogue.
I think one of the things that was really surprising to us, and you said that they were friends. They were mostly new friends.
That's true.
I mean, calling them friends that's what we got by the end of 3 days. But we didn't know each other to start with, most of us, and but very quickly, and I think it has to do with what I was saying before in terms of their depth of I think interest in having something happen, their depth of practice, spiritual practice, meant that by very quickly there was something tangible between us that more than one of us recognized as sacred, recognized as something beautiful, something exquisite. And and even though there were ups and downs and around the corners, and this wasn't a straight process, the fact that emerged so quickly, and with people we didn't know, with people who have very very different belief systems than we do, but have some, as I said, some recognition of a spiritual dimension, a depth dimension, consciousness itself, that made this field emerge. And then what you were saying, Thomas, that then the conversation can move from that.
And also it was very interesting that, at least for me, it opened up a lot of questions about what do we mean by human development. Does our Western, even integral Western framework really hold in a global dialogue? Or is our pre-contextualization of a global dialogue in a Western even integral philosophy already something that we are forcing on the dialogue. And you brought into the introduction and to have a Habermasian perspective. Is this already a lack of a free dialogue space where you come without any preconceived idea of development, what you just basically you together, human people, and see what is emerging as we are talking, also in terms of the understanding of depth and breadth of human consciousness. Because one thing, a very simple thing I was very touched by, as I said, we had this dialogue in a valley in the foothills of the Indian Himalaya, and the people who invited us there, the organization is called Organization for the Integrated Development of the Himalayas. They had a schooling project the last 20 years where they were teaching in these mountain villages kids for 20 years. And when we are talking about villages, we are talking about places without streets and without electricity, in that kind of sense. And they were talking in terms of understanding human non-separation, how much they learned from these people in the villages. They said they came with a kind of an Indian educated arrogance. We teach them how to develop, but they understood at some point how these villages were in an integrated whole together, maybe in a pre-individuated way or whatever, but that's already our Western perspective on this. We can discuss this, how much this does hold or not hold. But they were together on something where they had a form of organic wholeness of human consciousness that was very much related to what our longing as Western intellectuals and they as Indian educated intellectuals were referring to. So that the kind of relationship between the teaching and the being taught situation was kind of not so clear anymore. And without having any romantic conclusions to that, I think it's important to be open to see that there are some things that are just very interesting when we talk about what can open up in a global conversation, because all of a sudden I was sitting there with this Indian friends, they telling us about their 20 years of education process, and I felt also the transmission of this wisdom of these villages. And I'm still kind of grappling, what does this mean about human consciousness? What does it mean about the unity of human consciousness? What do I have to learn from these villages?
That's beautiful. And I mean, again, it's reminding me of the transformative learning work, you know, and it's that sense where the blur between who's teaching who. And the shock that, as you're saying, these intelligent Westerners have to find sophistication where you wouldn't think there would be. And I think we have a much too simplistic view both of the individual development and cultural development in the integral kind of meta-narrative that's emerged in the wake of especially Ken Wilber's work. And you know, what's striking and what I want to hold and surface here is this paradox that on the one hand, we're finding that those who have dedicated lives to spiritual practice and reflective work and scholarship and communication can achieve these elite kind of spaces. Yet on the other hand, this is a phenomenon that's always already present in large swaths of humanity. I'm thinking of, you know, the teams in athletics that just gel for this beautiful moment and they're all in flow together, or in the wake of an emergency like a hurricane or an earthquake, those spontaneous kind of symphonies of unique selves that work together to create, you know, what people need in the moment. So it's almost like behind our backs these things take place. When we try to orchestrate them, let's say at a university or at a town hall meeting or at an internet chat room about a political issue, we can't find it, you know. So that's to say that this is always already the case with everyone, and it's a potentiality in almost everyone. And yet when we go looking for it and we try to engineer it, it takes this training and it takes this dedication and awareness and practice. So when you think about bringing this to, say, the stage of global leadership and actually facilitating a truly selfless conversation between world leaders, the work that would have to be done to engineer that. No, that's what I'm saying. The capacities they would need to have to engineer that, to just have a conversation between them that you can find in any village that's trying to dig a well. I'm of course romanticizing, but I think you're getting my point, that there's something complicated here, as Thomas is pointing out. What does this mean about development? That often we lose something as we develop, and can see it, but we can also reclaim it at a higher level in a more sophisticated, less oppressive, better way. So just reflecting that and opening that up.
I think, to go back to your point about Habermas at the beginning, or the thing you were alluding to about his seeing that one of the most important things that human beings need to develop and foster at this point are communication practices that are not oppressive, or that are outside of the paradigm of dominant and subordinate, and that seems to given human history on the planet, and that includes sort of kind of at almost every level of human interaction, economic, educational, PR, whatever, that finding ways for us to actually meet and to communicate and to share our experience in a way that where we're not framing each other's experience by our own, and particularly as Westerners, that we're not framing others' experience in terms of Western models, even though to some extent it's the bias that we come with, and that's also something that just has to be what it is. But doing the work to engage in dialogue that is that holds equal respect for the epistemology and life experience of all present is, I think, is critical for us at this point, because our leaders can't come together, it seems, in a selfless conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean that's the delicate balance of trying to come in and not impose your framework, and yet at the same time, if you slide into a relativism, you disrespect the other view as well, right? And I know that's not where you're going, but there's a way in which you have to also be critical when criticism is necessary of of the alternative view. And this is, I find, the most delicate dance that any, let's say, sophisticated Westerner has to, where you're trying desperately to respect another culture, and yet there are moments in that culture that are warranted of critique. And so how do you, how do you find that shared sense of value where you can join them in their own self-criticism and your own self-criticism? I mean, I'm thinking of the work of Adi Died, Not To Is Peace, where he says, in order for people to actually come together globally, we all need to lose face simultaneously.
Exactly.
And only then can we look one another in the eye, right?
Right.
Because you can't, everyone is guilty and everyone's innocent, right? And until we realize that, then there'll always be these dominant subordination, communicative kind of pathologies, where the one culture shames the other, and yet the culture doing the shaming is the most shame-worthy culture to play. You know what I mean? Like, Americans shame other cultures, and we have no shame. So I think it's a complicated dance to engage. I admire your bravery, because as a white, privileged Westerner, it's very hard to go and to be in this space and to have the vulnerability and to hear the alternative story that so radically undermines your own identity, so there's again, that's one of these barriers. There's an emotional barrier that I think a lot of people have, talking across those differences. It's challenging. Thomas, you were saying?
No, you're completely right, because also in particular, because of the course of world history, going there as a Westerner, it has to be confrontative, because there are a lot of stories that are not part of the common story yet. As the common global story, as it is unfolding right now, is extremely predominated by a Western American European framework. There are a lot of stories that are coming in right now, and they will come in even more in the near future. The Indian and the Chinese perspective on stories, they differ radically from our perspective of what world history is about what the course of world history is about what are the main frameworks to how to kind of see what this process is about. Are we able to talk to each other in a way that we are able to hear each other? And I think what you brought in from Adida, I think, is one of the important ingredients here to really lose face. That means there has to be a sphere of the unknown between us. And that's a tall order to hold in this conversation between individuals, but also in a conversation between cultures, a sphere of the unknown. And at the same time, you also have to hold the other pole. You have to hold the reality of differences. Because you can't kind of impose your framework and your own value system, but at the same time, you have to hold it as your reality, as the thing that is basically the framework you come to this openness to. And is one able to hold both the reality of the difference that's held by different value systems and the openness of just human community meeting, right. Dialogue? That's a real process that is difficult enough between individuals, but in the process of globalization, I think we have to develop practices to do this between cultures. And I think that's something that is necessary. And also to bring in, because you brought in Habermas' perspective on non-oppressive conversations, there is also, I think, one distinction that Habermas makes, which I think is crucial to this form of dialogue, that is this distinction between system worlds and life worlds. The system worlds that are held up through theoretization and abstraction, and a mental process that in itself is important because it creates a lot of cultural necessary goods and developments that we have to hold. But there's the concreteness of human life worlds that we have to appreciate as being different. And I think some of the things dialogue has to bring in is the reality of the life world of aliveness in human beings coming together and just talking. And Habermas is really he says one of the main questions of our social change process is the question of colonization of the life worlds and the system worlds. Right. Is it possible that we hold up and develop our life worlds that so even our system worlds can be informed by the aliveness of human community, of human communion? I think that's part of what we are talking about here.
Absolutely. Sorry, Elizabeth, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's even something as powerful as integral theory. Because one of the things that Thomas has been saying lately that I find quite fascinating is that integral theory can't exist really in life as a theory. It has to exist as dialogue, because it's in the integration can't happen from a systematizing theory on top of everything. It has to happen in relationship, in the aliveness of human relationship, being explored and worked with, and without one dominating another. And yet, at the same time, and I think this is part of what you were also saying, is that we can't not be who we are either. We can be sensitive, we can be open, but my biases, in a certain way, are my biases. But it's being open to having them challenged and having them reworked, having them held in community, a community of difference that allows me to see them from a different angle, that allows them to be part of a whole where I don't dominate.
Well, thank you for bringing that in, because I think that's particular for the integral community. I think an important thing to contemplate also. I think that a mature integral has more the nature of a dialogue than of a theory. I think for integral to develop against postmodern relativism, it was and is still important to say, no, not everything is relative. There is the possibility of integration. And Ken put it really to this kind of radical point that he was making, creating a theory of everything. But there's a difference in holding a theory or participating in a dialogue. It's a shift in perspective, because a theory is something that you can hold as a whole. A dialogue, you only can participate in. A dialogue only works as a dialogue if there is the other, which is not part of your perspective in the dialogue. So the other is a part of the perspective seeing integral as a dialogue that is different than a theory that you can agree on or don't agree, or maybe not agree on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and it's like we're kind of channeling Habermas. Maybe it's because you guys are in Germany, but he said early on in the critical theory that critical theory needs to be fundamentally dialogical and not monological. And it is, of course, a liability of integral theory that when you read the books, etc., but of course it is just a simple monological theory. But I think Habermas has been more explicit in saying that praxis is what the goal is, which is that merger of theory and practice, which is necessarily dialogical, because praxis is communal by its very definition, you know. And so I think there's that sense in which to really be doing integral theory is to be engaged in integral forms of praxis, you know. And this is the ways that we use integral theory at Meridian, at least try to, is to talk about integral praxis more than integral theory, because integral theory is a lens, and you can look as your isolated, self-interested individual through your integral lens at the world and make, you know, make systemic decisions. But to really do the work, you need to hold it as a form of praxis, and it ends up being a praxis about communication and dialogue.
Right, and that means, yes, then that you are outside of yourself. You know, that ideally, that you are not in your own bubble of theoretical awareness, but you are actually having to engage with a different reality that comes at you as another human being.
And interesting enough, it in itself is by its nature evolutionary, because if you step into a dialogue, you step into a process of praxis. It's not a theory you can hold on to. Of course, you can develop a theory, but the dialogue is by its nature something that only exists as a process.
Right, and it creates emergence. I mean, I think that's the other thing that we've been dancing around here, is that, you know, one of the reasons the system colonizes the life world is because it's trying to control the unpredictable. Going back to knowledge and human interest, Habermas was saying that science and technology is about control and prediction of nature. And we control and predict human nature through bureaucracies and things of that those forms of structure. And so one of the ways to think about, you know, how to get back to life world is to create those pockets of freedom where the unpredictable can happen and where humanity can be liberated. And that is, in a sense, that form of integral praxis. To reclaim the vibrancy of the life world is the only place that solutions come up. And this is why the huge companies try to resist, like Google or whatever, these tech companies. They try to create these little pockets, and what would otherwise be a bureaucratized, profit-driven company, little pockets of freedom for a small team to try to do something creative. So there's a way in which we're finding, you know, even in the most liberal tech sectors, we're still colonizing uniqueness and colonizing these things for profit. But I think there's a way that we can open up even broader spaces, especially in political discourse, as you guys have been experimenting with, to bridge across cultures and to stand in a space of not knowing and to see what actually happens when two cultures don't try to appropriate one another as monological, self-interested entities, but actually constellate and interanimate and really create something new. That's exactly what,
and I think that's our hope and you could say mission is to try to create those kinds of pockets, and help people develop the skills. Because in the conversation we've had, I don't know if I could even run through them all, the kinds of capacities and self-knowledge and also world knowledge that one needs to have in order to be able to participate in these pockets across cultures, across civilizations, with a small diverse community of people, or small diverse pods of people, to create this this creative life world where something can happen that we don't know. What we're to do that requires quite a bit from the individual, and particularly for, I think, those of us from the West who have not been schooled in depth, to put it mildly. And so it's like our hope is to be able to help people develop the skills and capacities to be able to engage in this way, rather than thinking, oh, I've got friends on Facebook from 43 different countries, so I'm a global citizen. And I think that these pockets are where the things that where the system world can't expect, or where the system world can't control, that the potential for something different can come, or at least the dignity and creativity of humanity can thrive in some way. And it feels to me something quite urgent for us as a species at this point.
Yes, and I mean, and Habermas' one of his points anyway about it is that there are certain forms of social life that we need that can't be replaced by systemic mechanisms. And for example, human development, childcare, education. You can only systematize childcare to a point before it actually becomes counterproductive. So there are forms of socialization that, if you don't have uncoerced communication growing up as a child, you become distorted in your personality. So I think there's a depth there to the capacity development and the challenge of the capacity development for this. So I'm looking at the time, and I want to pause and check the questions and see if there's been any questions. So let's see. I'll go to the question bubble. So I'm actually not seeing any questions. So that either means that they're totally enthralled and captivated, or they have no idea what we're talking about.
Could be either. Or something in between.
So on that note, but I'm getting a text here that there are 3 questions, but I can't see them.
Okay.
Maggie, could you just read one of the questions, or show me how to get to the questions? I'm not sure why I can't see them.
Sure. So our first question comes from Brian McConnell. It's, to this point, while it sounds as though, quote, liberation might serve as an orienting objective, I wonder if Thomas and Elizabeth have any suggestions as to how to work effectively with the complexity posed by the agendas reflected by individuated levels.
Any sense of how to handle that, you guys?
What was the end of that?
Yeah,
I think the idea was so there needs to be a certain amount of awareness of consciousness and liberation, but how do we deal with the different levels of the individuals who are coming together? So I think it's a more precise form of the question I asked, which is how do we facilitate communication across where people who are individuated in such different ways, with cultural background, of course, if we talked about, but then there's actually developmental capacities. That's Elizabeth, you and I, this is what we studied in graduate school, and I've seen this happen in contexts where there are epistemological ships passing in the night, especially when you have people who are very linear thinkers or black and white thinkers, as opposed to people who are complex, systemic, multiple variables interacting type thinkers.
That's one of the most familiar ones, isn't it?
And it's a real challenge, and it characterizes a lot of the climate change debate, for example, and some of the debates around psychotherapy and preferable treatments and psychopharmacology is the difference between two boxes with arrows between them and a complex systemic, spaghetti string structure. And they're literally different ways of perceiving problems and viewing the world. And so I'm just wondering, given your experiences, what are your thoughts because I've got my own tricks to try to crack that and break the space up. But how do you get the cross-level dialogue going? I'm not expecting to have an answer, but I'm just wondering if there's reflections.
I mean, in engaging with, I think that's why we're to put it this way, we're picking our battles rather than sort of jumping into the lion's den with that one, frankly, because I think that basically what you're talking about is you have let's say a super rationalist linear thinker for whom psychology may be mumbo jumbo, let alone anything about spirit or or consciousness or whatever. Then where's the foundation? And that's a conversation that I think at this point I'm not sure that I would jump into. But I think that but in the work that we do with evolutionary dialogue, I think there may be somewhat of a way forward, and it depends on people's willingness. And one of the guidelines that we give to people is to we want you say we want to come up with something different, something new here. Can we be more interested in what we don't know already than in what we already know?
If you don't mind, I would like to jump into it.
Okay, you'll go with that. Give there. Okay.
I would like to get there because I think, and let's discuss if this is a right take on it. I think that maybe there's a different question behind this question, because I think that maybe the difference that you are describing, let's say, between linear and complexity thinking, is not the real question at stake in a form of dialogue. I would suggest what makes the difference is what we call the capacity to be consciousness and process aware. That from whatever perspective you come, you are aware because we are in a living situation called dialogue. There is a consciousness field between us. There is a conscious process between us that has a certain potentiality inherent to it that maybe is interpreted in different ways from a different capacity. But there are different perspectives. As long as you stay together in the aliveness of this field, the different perspectives that are held are in a kind of a productive contradiction. There's something alive that does not necessarily switch into conflict because you're able to be interested. There's something that has a more essential quality of potentiality. It keeps the conversation together and maybe makes it even more productive because of the difference of perspective to hold something that whatever the potentiality of a particular conversation is or not, depends on where someone wants to go in this conversation. But there's something that is possible in any kind of constellation of a dialogue.
Yeah, no, and I'm hearing echoes of like Bohmian dialogue, right, where you've seen working class guys, working class.
The real question is also, where can we go in this particular constellation? Maybe there's something I would like to go, but it's not the real potentiality of this dialogue. But there's something always possible in any constellation. Am I willing to go there? What is really possible, and how much I'm able to sense that, and also have the humility to see what is possible between us and be a catalyst for this, not what I would like to happen because I have some idea what should happen, which takes a lot, but it's more on being aware of what is happening between us as in consciousness and process than on the particular perspectives that we are holding.
Well, but what you're talking about is a facilitator's role.
Yeah.
We're talking about the facilitator's role in a situation where you have people who are at very different levels, and the importance of the facilitator holding a context that doesn't divide people. And it doesn't say, and that the facilitator doesn't say, unless I get these linear thinkers to start thinking systemically, then we're sunk. Because if you do that, you're sunk. You know.
I'm thinking, yeah. Sorry.
But this comes back to the kind of fundamental like guidelines that we're talking about. What you need to get from that's what you do when you're facilitating it. But when you're asking the participants to do is to be interested in what you don't already know, to be in sort of be in this conversation to see where you can where it can go. And to really listen. And I mean, those are some of the things that we ask people to do. And everyone almost at every developmental level, unless you're really, really emotionally disturbed, can actually do these things. So they're not high developmental tasks. And in that way, with a skilled facilitator, you can weave the input from the participants together in a way that holds something and will be productive. Rather than, but it starts probably with, I don't want those people who are at a different stage to kind of mess up the works, or they've got to develop, or something else has to happen with them in order for this dialogue to happen.
Right. No, you're right. And this idea that something's possible in any constellation.
Exactly.
And to see what you can get out of it. And I'm thinking in particular, I've taught, I've done teaching, especially of graduate students, and there's often quite a spread in a graduate school class. And I remember one time we were doing this brainstorm activity about bringing a new form of testing into schools. And all of us smart people were all thinking about this complex and how would the statistics work and how could we do it. And, a woman who'd been a teacher for a long time, who was a very linear thinker, great woman, she basically said, yeah, but are you going to pay the teachers more? And we're like, oh, whoa. You know what I mean? Like, she had seen a very simple linear that pulled the rug out from the entire plan. And so I think it's very important to realize that just because we think, higher is better, it's this kind of, a lot of intro parlance is that, or developmentalists are that, or even in developmental but it's not necessarily. It depends on the context and the problem you're working on, the degree to which higher is better. And so finding that sense in this constellation, there is a voice who can bring out that simple point. And we need to create the freedom for them to express themselves, but also not bring the conversation down to the lowest common denominator, because then the higher level. So there's that sense of orchestrating it, and that is a great challenge pedagogically. And then, of course, in the moment, even if you're a participant. So there's 2 minutes left. I don't think there's time for another question. So I'm gonna bring things to a close, and I just want to thank you guys very deeply. It's been a wonderful to get a chance to speak with you about your exciting work. I hope we can bring you back. I hope we can kind of get you more involved in perhaps teaching some at Meridian, which would be exciting.
Cool.
And so, and I want to thank the audience also for participating. Oh, please.
Can I do a shout out for? We're planning to do a 2-day free virtual global dialogue event with in September, 12th and 13th. If people are interested and want to get more information about that, or the next program we're running on global dialogue, they can go to the enlightenx.de website and scroll all the way down on the right side, and they can sign up there.
Awesome.
Put their emails in.
That's great. Yeah, so people should take advantage of that. That's wonderful. Yeah, so we'll be, again, for the audience, thank the audience, thank you guys.
You.
Thank you very much.
We'll be convening
another
integral voices dialogue soon. And so thank you everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening, Elizabeth and Thomas and everyone else around the world. Thanks again for participating.
Thank you.